Hello again, everybody. This is Derek, and I am coming back at you with another wargaming and miniature video. And in today's video, we're continuing on with our Land of the Free boot camp. And in today's chapter, we're going to be talking about scenery. And as you can see, I've laid out a variety of different pieces of scenery. But we're going to go over these in detail and how they affect the game. Now, scenery plays an integral part in wargaming, whether it signifies movement restrictions, provides cover for the troops, or makes the table more appealing to the players. No matter the reason, players should understand that all of the scenery represents prior to starting the game. Not every player has the same collection of scenery, so the scaling may not always be accurate from one gaming table to the next. The following scenery rules are provided as a guideline for consistency, so players are welcome to manipulate the rules for their gaming environment. Scenery provides advantages and disadvantages for elements wishing to move into, behind, or next to the terrain. Scenery may impact an element's movement, but will often provide a defensive position for it to fight from. There are two types of scenery in Land of the Free: linear obstacles and area terrain. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is linear obstacles. All right, linear obstacles. Linear obstacles consist of various types of terrain, such as man-made stone walls, fences, hedges, entrenchments, even in a river. They typically break up line of sight and provide cover for those elements who wish to take up defensive behind them. That wouldn't apply to a creek. Elements interacting with linear obstacles are required to either be on one side or the other, regardless of the element's formation, and may never straddle or stop on a linear obstacle. So what they're saying is, hypothetically, let's say this guy is in a march column, and being on fully over the obstacle is perfectly fine, but you can't stop something like that, where the obstacle, where you're on both sides of the obstacle. That would apply to all linear obstacles. You know, hedges, fences, walls. Now, an element is considered to receive the benefits of cover if at least half of its elements, including the leader stand, is blocked by or behind the linear obstacle. So, if the leader, something like that, that is considered in cover, because at least half of the element is behind cover, including the leader stand. So this would be in cover. That would not be in cover. This would also be in cover, obviously. Okay, so now we're going to talk about moving up to and over a linear obstacle. Linear obstacles that are less than the height of the foot soldiers count only as cover and may be crossed. So like this wall or fence is not taller than the miniature. You'd have to have a very, very tall wall. Linear obstacles that are equal to or taller than the height of the soldiers block line of sight and may not be crossed. When an element moves up to a linear obstacle, the element must stop once any part of the element comes into contact, regardless of its movement it has remaining. So if this guy wants to move up to this wall, And you can see that he's got more movement than the wall, right? He would still spend his one maneuver action and he would have to stop at the obstacle. An element is required to spend one maneuver order to cross a linear obstacle unless it was in march column. Then it would require two maneuver orders to cross. These maneuvers must be spent during the same activation, and elements may be given a forced order for one or both of the maneuvers necessary to cross the linear obstacle. If the forced order is failed, the element will remain on the side where it began and will end its turn immediately. Once the element spends the appropriate maneuvers to cross the linear obstacle, the element is placed directly on the opposite side with the back of its stands touching the linear obstacle. So no need to measure. You just pick your guys up and you put them on the other side with the back side of the bases or the stand connecting or touching the linear obstacle. So that would have been one maneuver action. If they were in march column, when they touched the linear obstacle, and you were able to pay two maneuver actions, then you would place the unit on the far side with the back touching the linear obstacle. The element must maintain its formation and is placed directly across from the point of origin on the opposite side of the linear obstacle. The element will receive one disorder marker for crossing the linear obstacle and may continue to receive orders as per the normal rules. If the element is in march column, then the last stand is placed touching the linear obstacle, with the remaining element placed in march column facing in the same direction prior to crossing the linear obstacle, just like I showed you right here. But if you maneuver at an angle, let's say, to the wall or the fence or what have you, you would have to spend your first action to get here, right? And then your second action would reach the wall, but you have to be flush with the wall. You can't take your first action, move up to the wall like this, and then spend your second action to cross the wall and be like this. Okay, you can't do that. You can't maintain your facing. When you would have to use enough maneuver actions to be flush with the wall. So if one got you here, you still can't spend your second maneuver action to cross the wall. You would have to spend your second maneuver action to become flush with the wall, and then your next maneuver action would get you over the wall. Now you can become creative. This is why I treated this or read this rule like this. Let's say you have a wall, a road with stone walls or fences on both sides of the road, and you are maneuvering down the road in march column, right? But you wish to cross the wall over here. You can spend an action to turn 90 degrees, spend your second action to cross the wall, and then spend your third action to turn 90 degrees, and you would have crossed. again, receiving the disorder for crossing a wall. Now remember, you don't have to spend maneuver actions removing disorder markers unless you start your turn with disorder markers. When you start your activation, you'll lose as many turns as you have disorder markers or maneuver actions. But if you gain them during your move, you still get to continue to use your actions to move. Okay, and that was me reading a little bit ahead. All right, occupying a linear obstacle. Elements that would like to take advantage of the cover from a linear obstacle and have the ability to shoot over the linear obstacle without suffering any penalties must have their stands adjacent to the linear obstacle. The linear obstacle must be less than the height of the foot soldiers in order for the element to draw a proper line of sight and shoot over it. This is not adjacent to the linear obstacle. You are not occupying the fence line. If you were up adjacent to the fences, then you would be considered occupying the linear obstacle. Elements may form to a linear obstacle in order to represent them utilizing the cover. An element will move up to the linear obstacle, and once it has come into contact with the element, will halt and conform to the linear obstacle. Oh, okay. So let me back up a second. I misspoke earlier. So it's not a house rule, it's actually written. So when you move up to the linear obstacle with your one action, you don't have to spend your second action. You can just move up and conform to the linear obstacle. Okay, so that saves you one maneuver order. That's outstanding. It's merely part of the element's movement to come into contact with the linear obstacle. This may cause the element to break its current formation, which is acceptable, but as soon as the element departs from the linear obstacle, it will dress the ranks and move back into the formation it was in before it occupied the linear obstacle. Okay, what they're saying here is fences and walls are not always straight. Sometimes they have bends or curves or, something like that. And when you move up to the linear obstacle, let's say this unit moves up and makes contact with the linear obstacle, it will conform to the linear obstacle. But this guy might break his formation, but he will conform to the linear obstacle to represent that they're occupying the linear obstacle. And then once they cross or depart the obstacle, this guy will just run up and reform properly. Elements may wrap themselves around a linear obstacle if they decide to occupy a bend or corner of the scenery. The element may elect to shoot in this manner, but regardless of the positioning of the stands, the element will target and shoot at enemy elements following the normal shooting procedure. Remember, you're measuring from the leader stand. Okay, crossing linear obstacles in tight spaces. There may be instances when an element is located in a confined space and will find it difficult to move or cross a linear obstacle. Okay, and that's why I gave you the example of the march column with the walls on both sides. Linear obstacles too short for an element. Maybe they're talking about something like that. Elements may move up to a linear obstacle and find that not all of its stands will have the benefit of the cover. As long as at least half of the stands, including the leader, are behind the linear obstacle, then the element will receive the advantages of cover. So in this case, they're not in cover. But if it was like that, they would be. We already talked about that. At least half of the stands are behind cover. shooting over a linear obstacle. An element that is lined up against the linear obstacle may shoot over it without suffering any penalties to the target behind cover. The linear obstacle must be less than the height of the soldiers who are firing. Elements lined up against a linear obstacle do not need to rotate in order to place the target within its threat zone, as long as the rest of the shooting rules are followed. Because if you remember, like if you shoot at a target that's outside your threat zone, and your threat zone always goes directly straight out from the edge of your bases, normally you would rotate to get your leader's threat zone to at least touch the element. But when you're occupying a wall or a fence or a hedge, you don't have to do that because you're taking advantage of the cover. Shooting through a linear obstacle. An element wishing to target an enemy element that has a linear obstacle within the line of sight will suffer a penalty for the target being in cover. The linear obstacle must be shorter than the height of the soldiers firing in order for the element to be a valid target. Yeah, that's a common theme. Shorter than the height, you can do it. The element that is occupying the cover will get the benefits of the cover. If a unit is out here, he would not get the benefits of the cover. There's an example. The element shooting element A, that's the purple, will receive a penalty. Okay, the element in red shooting element A will receive a penalty for element A being in cover. But if element A returns fire, it will also suffer the penalty of its target being in cover because neither one of them occupies it. On the other hand, on the right side, element B will receive cover from enemy fire, but since element B is against the wall, the target will not receive any cover. If you're shooting across the cover, it impedes your shot. But if you are adjacent to it, you don't suffer any penalties for shooting over cover. Okay, now we're going to talk about charging and the linear obstacle. Charging a linear obstacle. An element wishing to charge an enemy element that has taken position behind a linear obstacle will measure the distance from the leader to the base of the obstacle. If the charge is successful, the charging element will occupy one side of the linear obstacle with the target element on the opposite. So if that unit is in cover and the 1st New Hampshire here decides to charge them, he doesn't have to measure from his base to the base. He only has to measure to the base of the linear obstacle, or however you have it modeled. So he would measure to the obstacle, and they would fight their melee with the obstacle right there in the middle of them. The procedure for charging into a melee remained the same, with one exception. If the charging element moves into contact with the obstacle during the first movement, it will not need to conduct its second movement. But the opposing player will still have an opportunity to declare a charge reaction and utilize snap fires and countercharge in between the movements. So it counts as kind of like a slowing effect. If the charging element wins the melee, it may use its free maneuver to cross the obstacle. But remember, the maneuver will cause the element to receive a disorder marker on top of the disorder marker for fighting in a melee. So let's say they charge in, they conduct a melee, they lose, they withdraw, right? I'm just going to move them off to the side here. They can cross them. Okay, they're going to receive a disorder marker anyway, and then they can cross using their follow-up move. And if doing so, crossing the obstacle will cause them a disorder marker. What that represents is not everybody able to cross the wall at the same time. It causes lines to get separated or scattered a little bit, and you got to spend time adjusting or straightening your line. Okay, charging across a linear obstacle. Okay, let's go ahead and put the 9th foot here. Nobody has occupied the linear obstacle at this moment. Elements wishing to charge an element that is on the opposite side of a linear obstacle but not against it must first cross the linear obstacle prior to declaring the charge. An element may not cross a linear obstacle during the charge maneuver. So he can't charge him. And he wouldn't be able to charge him because there's not enough room in there. So I'm going to adjust a little bit. During this activation, I would not be allowed to charge him because you can't charge over an obstacle, but you can use your initial maneuvers to cross the obstacle. So he would spend an action to move up to the obstacle, as we all know. He would spend his second maneuver action to cross the obstacle, gaining a disorder marker, and then from there, he would be able to declare a charge and close in and conduct melee. All right, and that was linear obstacles. Now we're going to talk about area terrain. The North American landscape was littered with vast forests, large swamps, rolling hills, mountain ranges, and huge tracts of farmland. To simplify the effects of the various types of scenery that would be in play, we group it into area terrain. If any part of the element comes into contact with area terrain, when the entire element will suffer the movement penalties, if any apply. For this reason, the area terrain should be delineated by an outline of some kind. The terrain could be marked by using string, a template, scenery showing boundaries. The templates can be made of various materials such as felt, cardstock, wood, plastic, or even paper. Texture and scenery making materials can be added to the templates to give them a look. Before we get started, I just want to point something out. If you have a bunch of trees on the table, right, that might look good as a forest or what have you, but it doesn't give you a clear outline of where that forest begins. And a lot of times in miniature wargaming, when you move troops through a forest, you have a tendency to move trees out of the way so that you can place your troops in the forest. And what that does is it changes the shape of your forest if you don't have a way to identify the outer edges. And when you play a game that uses stands that represent large formations of units, the stand is usually clearly defined, scaled, or sized specifically for the rule set that you're using, or the amount of men it represents, or the amount of area on the table it should occupy. The same thing should apply for your scenery, because it's not a one-to-one, and trees don't move. A little history lesson for me When I played a game a long time ago called Command Decision, we would set up forests, but I would with trees like this, but because the shape and size of these forests in this campaign that I ran would be, because I used like a realistic map, would be so varied and so random. You know, every forest would be a different shape or a different size. It would be impractical for me to make a template to lay down on the table. So what I used was green yarn. I took green yarn and I laid it out on the table, however big the forest was. And yarn has kind of a like a Velcro-y effect. It would stick to the table, and it wouldn't move around. Now sometimes a figure that you sit on the yarn might pick it up and move it, but after that happens a couple of times, you will remember to hold the yarn down when you pick your troops up. So that was no big deal. But if you moved trees around inside that area of yarn, that would be fine, because the tree line was clearly defined, as you know exactly where it was. As I broke away from that type of game, I started to make templates, and this is with MDF, and you notice how there's like nothing on it. It's just grass, right? Because I would later come in and put trees occupying this board, and that would signify that this area was a forest or a tree line. And this way you could tell when your units were in it or outside of it, because if the base was on top of the other base, you knew, right? But I made this big one, for 25 or 28 millimeter figures, and I would, in today's battlefield, I might consider this a little bit too big, unless I was trying to go for like a very large forested area. But now I've made some forest boundaries, and I put a little grass along the edge, just to kind of, this could be a field, this could be a wooded area. This one was made specifically for a scenario. I shaped it and sized it specifically for a World War II scenario, but it could be used for any genre. And it's made out of felt, right? That's felt, and it's got a layer of putty on there, and then again, just like before, you can put your trees on there, and you know exactly where the edge of the woods are. And then you can move the trees around if you needed to occupy this area. You know, you can shuffle these just to let you know that they're in the woods. That's pretty much the way I do all of my, and I do woods like that, and I do anything that I need to move the terrain piece around to allow a formation of troops to go into, which is almost 99% woods. So let's talk about that. Sorry, went on a tangent. Differences in area terrain. There are going to be instances where players will agree that the area terrain will restrict movement, but not line of sight, or vice versa. For example, rocky ground or a plowed field. Also, felt with spackle putty put on top and then painted. It might hinder the element's movement, but the scenery is not high enough to block line of sight. The visibility is incredibly limited in high crops like corn. And in my case, I just go ahead and use a floor mat to represent crop fields. But the element could easily maintain its formation while navigating the field. The player should discuss the scenery before the game begins in order to avoid any confusion. Occupying area terrain. An element is considered to occupy area terrain and receives the bonus of cover if at least half of the element, including the leader, are in or touching the area terrain. Okay, so at least half of the stands, which is 2 out of 3, is in or touching the area terrain. Okay, how does it affect line of sight? Elements that are considered to be occupying area terrain have their line of sight and threat zone restricted to 6 inches. And I want everyone to remember, this might not have come up earlier in the boot camp, so I'm going to touch on it right now. All the ranges given in the book are for 25 to 28 millimeter miniatures. If you're playing in a game like a 10 mil or a 6 mil, or I'm sorry, a 10 mil or a 15 mil game, you're going to want to reduce the size by 2/3. And so that's why I made these range rulers, where each of these 2-inch sections represent 3 inches of measurement in the rule book. So 2 of these would be 6 inches, even though in reality it's only 4 inches. So if he was occupying, his threat zone would only be 6 inches. Even if he was here, it would still only be 6 inches. Elements wishing to draw a line of sight to an occupying element will have their line of sight reduced to 6 inches. So it goes both ways. So he only has a line of sight of 6 inches, so he would not be able to see him or shoot at him. There may be instances when multiple linear obstacles and area terrain are within the line of sight. The advantages of cover do not stack. So once a target element benefits from cover, it does not matter how much cover they have. If an element does not have enough stands to be considered occupying area terrain, then the element's line of sight and threat zone will be unaltered, as it will not receive any benefits of occupying area terrain. So what they're kind of implying is, if you're sitting like that, where less than half your element is in or touching, then you do not benefit from area terrain. And so your threat zone would be back to 12, and you could be seen. As long as at least half your element stands and the leader are overlapping the area terrain border or touching the area terrain border, then the element will receive the benefits of occupying area terrain, and it will have its normal line of sight and threat zone. Okay, so what they're saying here is, here's the border. As long as at least half of your unit is touching the border, which basically means you're right up on the edge of it, then you will not be restricted to 6-inch threat zone and 6-inch shooting. It's only if you're inside the area terrain. If you're right along the border, then you can shoot out of it and see out of it as normal. Elements occupying area terrain and having a normal line of sight and threat zone will also suffer from enemy elements being able to draw a normal line of sight against them. Elements cannot draw a line of sight into, through, or out of area terrain to target an element, no matter how narrow the area of terrain may be. There is too much interference for an element on one side of area terrain to shoot or charge a target element on the other side. It'll block line of sight between the two enemy elements. So no matter what, if you have a very small area terrain, let's say you've got a patch of woods here, and I laid out my yarn, and the yarn is only like 2 inches wide, and these guys are well within their shooting ranges and stuff, you still cannot shoot through to the other side. Okay, moving into, through, or out of area terrain. The formation of an element will determine its ability to navigate area terrain either with ease or difficulty. So elements in open formation, where they're spaced out a little bit, so left spaces between their soldiers in order to widen their frontage, reduce casualties, and maneuver around obstacles. Each maneuver order an element in open formation spends, moving into, through, or out of area terrain, will reduce its movement by 1 inch. Elements in battle line formation employ the benefits of increased morale and an increased fighting prowess in melee, but this formation is cumbersome when attempting to keep formation over broken landscape. Elements in battle line will have their movement value halved per maneuver order when moving into, through, or out of area terrain. So you get half movement in this formation, and you get -1 in that formation. March column. March column provides an element with a narrow frontage, but is not the ideal formation for fighting. The narrow frontage allows the formation to find deep paths or other trails through area terrain, but the length of the formation slows down the ability to clear the area terrain. An element in March column may only move half its movement value per maneuver order when moving into, through, or out of terrain. Okay, so this element like this is halved as well. But remember, a march column moves faster than a battle line, but then it will be halved. They're both halved. Shooting into, through, or out of area terrain. Elements wishing to shoot into, through, or out of area terrain are bound by the same restrictions as drawing a proper line of sight. Shooting ranges are reduced to 6 inches, shooting into or out of area terrain. Yeah, that's a little contradictory. That's okay. Okay, charging into, through, or out of area terrain. Charging into, through, or out of area terrain is restricted by the line of sight that the element has when it declares the charge. When declaring a charge into or out of area terrain, the element will only suffer the movement penalties for both movements as long as one or both movements are in area terrain. So that half movement applies to charging as well. And remember, it blocks line of sight through it, so you can't charge through it. But if he was to move into the area terrain, he would then be able to see 6 inches out of the area terrain, and he could charge. And that's the only area terrain that blocks line of sight. There are other pieces of area terrain, like plowed fields, that don't affect your line of sight. So it might slow your movement, but it doesn't stop your visibility. Okay, so now we're going to talk about buildings. You can't have a war game without buildings. You may want to incorporate buildings into your war games, and there's a myriad of manufacturers on the marketplace, with some of them offering interiors and removable roofs and others providing simple one-piece castings. Regardless of the type, you should determine before the game begins what the buildings represent and what their capacity is to hold elements. If players elect to allow the buildings to be occupied, then they will operate using the following rules. Okay, so there's building sizes and occupation limits. Now remember, this is not a one-to-one game. So these men, being 15 millimeter, represent a number of meters, however tall they are. And just because there's 6 figures on the space doesn't mean there's only 6 men. That could represent a couple of hundred men. So if this is like 600 men, this would not represent one building, right? This could represent a group of buildings. But just for visual aesthetics and visual appeal, you would have a building template, a lot like your area terrain, and one or more buildings on that. You could place templates representing area that one or more buildings might occupy. The size of the template would dictate the number of elements that could occupy that space at any given time. This will allow you to design templates to meet the needs of your game, as well as provide an opportunity to create some great hobby projects. By cutting or designing templates to the sizes below, you will generate some clear parameters for buildings just by knowing the size of each building template. Okay, and they have 4 sizes: tiny, small, medium, and large, just like the element sizes. And they go 3, 6, 9, and 12 inches. Now remember that in 15 millimeter, we're reducing it by 2/3. A 6-inch square template would only be 4 inches in this reduced scale. So this being a 4-inch board, it represents the 6-inch template. This represents the 9-inch template, even though it is 6 inches across. This would be a perfectly fine template for 25 millimeter miniature, and it would represent a small building, but because it's 15 millimeter, it represents the medium building. And then the small would be 3. So you go 3, 6, 9, and 12. And I'll get to the 12 in just a second. Imagine a 12-inch square on your table being a large village or a town, and you would put multiple buildings on that. But again, remember, that's for 25 millimeter miniatures. So the 3, 6, 9, and 12 represent how many stands can occupy it. This being a small building or tiny, it could hold a tiny element. The small building section could hold 2 stands, right? And that would work perfectly fine. And then the medium could hold your 3 bases, and then a large would hold 5 stands, because that would be the size of a large element. And I'll get into that in just a second. So they have the same classification of sizes as elements, so players will determine whether the building is tiny, small, medium, or large. Elements that are the same size or smaller than the building size may occupy it, but only one element may occupy a building at any given time. For example, a large building may occupy a single element of any size, but may not be occupied by 2 elements that are smaller in size. One building, one element. Okay, so I want to talk about the large. This is just from my I want to talk a couple of things, actually. Okay, so that's your medium. That was your small. And a 2x2 would be your tiny. Now, a tiny it would be a 3-inch square, or a 2x2 in 15s. My smallest building barely sits on that. I've considered using a slightly bigger base, a 2x3, and a building would fit on there a lot more appropriate. Now, I still can't put a single stand on this base with the building, so the building would have to get pushed to the side a little bit to get it to occupy the template. But you could do that. You could move the building a little bit off to the side and put your element in there. So I'm thinking I'm going to do 2x3s, or 50x75, or maybe 50x60 is what I was originally considering, but I don't know. Okay, so now I made some small templates. Now if I put 4 small templates together, this would be the same size as a large building base. So I could occupy it with a large element of 5 stands. So I've gotten away, that way I don't have to make an 8x8 template. I can just use 4 of my 4x4s. All right, occupying a building. Only infantry and dismounted cavalry elements may occupy a building. Artillery elements may occupy a building if the building was within the deployment area during setup, and if the occupation is agreed upon by both players or written into the scenario. A sense of logic should dictate that the deployment of artillery, such as the element being placed in a barn or in a courtyard that is surrounded by multiple buildings, artillery placed in a building during setup may not be moved for the remainder of the game. The element wishing to occupy a building must move up to the building, stop its movement once it comes into contact with the building or template, regardless of the movement it has remaining, a lot like a linear obstacle. Once the element is in contact, the element spends a maneuver order and then occupies the building. The location of the doorways or openings on the building or template is irrelevant because the maneuver order spent to occupy the building reflects the element's ability to move into the building in the most efficient manner possible. They would occupy through the doors, they would jump over the walls, they would go into windows, or whatever. So when you move up into contact with the building, template in this case, then you would just use your maneuver order to deploy into the building. And you can place them anywhere in the building, facing in any direction. When the element occupies the building, it is considered to be an open order, with a few exceptions. The element no longer needs to spend maneuver actions to move within the building, since the element is considered to have positioned its troops along all of the windows and doorways and openings. The element occupying the building does not have a flank, so enemy elements will never receive a bonus for flank attack. Players will measure to and from the building or template's sides rather than the element occupying the building. Elements occupying a building have their firepower and their ability to react to an enemy's movement dramatically reduced. To this end, elements that occupy a building have no threat zone, so they will be unable to conduct snap fires or announce countercharges. Elements in a building cannot be supported if they are fighting in melee, but they can support other melees if they are within range. So if these guys are on the same side and he gets meleeed, he can't support them. But if he gets meleeed, he could support them. Exiting a building. An element wishing to exit a building must spend a maneuver order and place the element in any formation as long as the element is touching the building or template. The element will suffer a disorder marker once it has exited the building and may continue to receive orders per the normal rules. The player may select which side the element will exit the building as long as the element does not contact or overlap any enemy or friendly elements. Yeah, so you can't, exit on this side of the building if this guy's in the way. Unless you wanted to exit the building over here like this. Because at least your element is touching the base. So it could exit over here, and then that would be its one maneuver and receive a disorder marker. Shooting from a building. Elements that occupy a building will have their visibility and line of sight on all sides of the building, regardless of the actual location of the doors, windows, or openings. When the element wishes to shoot, it will spend a combat order and may select up to 2 target elements, ignoring the normal targeting rules. The sides of the buildings are used to determine the element's arc of sight, and the line of sight is measured from the center of each building's side. Once all the targets and sides of the building have been selected for shooting, the player will create a dice pool for the element, adjusting the pool for any disorder markers. The player may then allocate the remaining dice in the pool to each target, ensuring that the minimum of 1 is selected for each target. After the dice have been divided for each target, the target's shooting modifiers will be applied and based on the conditions of each target. You don't have to split fire, but you can. Okay, shooting into a building. Elements shooting at targets occupying a building will follow the normal shooting rules and modifiers, except that the element will draw a line of sight and measure to the building instead of the element. The position of the doors, windows, and openings are inconsequential as long as you can draw a line of sight to the building. An element in or occupying a building is considered to be in cover. Artillery solid shot, mortars, and rockets targeting buildings. Artillery elements using solid shot, mortars, and rockets targeting an enemy element inside a building do not suffer any penalties for cover. You can just blast them out of the building. Charging an occupied building. Only infantry and dismounted cavalry elements may declare a charge against elements that occupy a building. So no cab charges against a building. The normal rules apply for players wishing to have an element charge an appropriate target, but the distance is measured to the building. Conducting a melee against an element that occupies a building is performed using the normal rules, except both the charging element and the element occupying the building will roll half of their action dice, rounded up, before adjusting their dice pool with the melee modifiers. So you only get to fight with half your guys. The element occupying the building is considered to be in a defensive position. When resolving the combat resolution, the winner and loser will be determined using the normal rules with the following exceptions. The element occupying the building will not withdraw if it loses combat, will not suffer a disorder marker for fighting in melee. The charging element will remain in contact with the building if it wins combat, and may continue to use combat orders to initiate another melee. The element occupying the building will only withdraw from the building if it leaves voluntarily, fails a discipline morale test, or is shattered. If the element occupying a building loses a melee and withdraws because it failed a discipline morale check, then the winning element may occupy the building immediately, regardless if it is the active element or not. This is a free movement and does not count as a free maneuver order if the winner is the active element. Let's say these guys are occupying this building. These guys charge up to the building, they conduct a melee, and they win. They don't have to withdraw. They can stay attached to the building. They don't have to withdraw unless they fail a discipline morale check, and then the turn ends. Let's just say he runs out of his action dice or his combat dice. On the following turn, the British player activates this unit. It has to melee, so it spends a die and it becomes the active unit, and they lose and they withdraw. But because he's not the active unit, he's still allowed to occupy the building. That's what that last bullet point was. All right, and finally we're going to talk about hills. High ground is of paramount importance during combat, as it provides fantastic viewpoints of the battlefield and allows artillery a vantage point to protect the infantry. Artillery during this time period was not incredibly accurate, and the risk of hitting your own troops by firing over their heads was too great. Placing on artillery on hills to fire over their own forces lowered the risk, depending on the distance to the target. Artillery shooting from hills. If cannon artillery elements are on higher ground, are attempting to fire at a target, and there are friendly elements within the fire zone, then the following conditions must be met. The friendly elements cannot be within the shooting artillery element's threat zone. Okay, so you can't be within 12 inches. You'd have to be much further. Well, 12 inches, remember, is only this far. The friendly element is not within the threat zone, which is 4 of these, right? Right there. The friendly element cannot be within the target element's threat zone. Okay, so if the target element was turned and his threat zone goes directly like this, it doesn't matter how close to him you are. Mortar and rocket artillery elements follow the normal shooting rules when on a hill. So he could fire at him because he is not within his threat zone and he is not within his threat zone. But if he was turned just a little bit like this, you would not be able to shoot at him. I don't know I don't necessarily follow the reasoning behind that, but that's the rules. Infantry and cavalry shooting from hills. If infantry and cavalry elements are firing from a hill, they will follow the normal line of sight and shooting rules. Hills and line of sight. Easiest and most effective way to check line of sight when hills are involved is for the players to lower their heads and get a soldier's eye view of their line of sight. If the hills block line of sight or provide cover for an element, then it'll be the easiest way to determine this situation. So yeah, you just get down, squat down behind your troops next to the table and look through their virtual eyes. All right, now the next video, that was the end of terrain. The next video is called Advanced Rules, which really talk about unit characteristics. Like, are they grenadiers? Are they Hessians? Are they elite? You know, that kind of stuff. Are they Indians, light infantry, militia? And we're going to talk about what that means for each individual unit. And then with those classifications come certain skills, which are basically the modifiers that the units will receive by being that, like marksmen or rifles or inspirational charge. These are skills that they could possibly receive based on their special characteristics. Plus, we'll talk about historically what certain types of units would have received those type of special skills to help you design your own scenarios or build your own historically accurate units. We'll also talk about optional rules like ammunition shortages and multiple elements occupying buildings, etc. These are optional rules. And then I would like to get into briefly going over the different scenarios and briefly going over some of the historical scenarios that are in the book, just kind of breezing through them. But my point is that entire video is going to be me at my computer with the document on the screen, and you get to see the book as I scroll through the pages. There would be no need for that kind of stuff to be shown on the table. We can just look at it in the rule book. All right, so in the next video, we'll be at the table. At the computer table, that is. All right, thank you for coming out and checking out this boot camp video. We're almost in the conclusion. This was the penultimate episode, I do believe. And I will catch you in the next video.